You are holding on to something right now. You can feel it. A deal you keep pushing. A person you keep trying to reach. A version of your life that refuses to arrive no matter how hard you work toward it. And you are not letting go. Not because it is working, but because letting go feels like giving up. You are not the only one who has been there. But here is what almost no one says about that grip, that need to force things into place. It is not strength. It is fear wearing the mask of effort. This is a story about a man named Wei, a merchant, a man who believed that if he pushed hard enough, long enough, everything would eventually yield. And it almost did, until the day everything stopped. Welcome to the silent lesson. Wei was a trader of silk in a city along the old trade routes of ancient China. He had built his business the way a carpenter builds a table, joint by joint, nail by nail, nothing left to chance. Every negotiation was prepared. Every handshake was calculated. He kept lists of what people owed him. He kept lists of what he owed others. He kept lists of what needed to happen by the end of each month, each season, each year. His wife called him careful. His rivals called him relentless. His son, who was 12 years old and had already been told which school he would attend and which trade he would learn, simply called him father, in a voice that carried something flat in it. Wei did not notice the flatness. He was too busy building. But the building had a history. Wei's father had been a farmer, a careful, patient man who lost 3 consecutive harvests to drought. Not from inattention, not from any failure of work, simply because the sky did not cooperate. Wei had watched his father negotiate with merchants who held all the leverage, had watched him bow his head and accept terms that felt like punishment for the crime of needing rain. The boy who watched all of this made a decision, quietly, privately, at an age when decisions feel like revelations, that he would build something the weather could not touch, something that did not depend on forces outside his control. So he controlled everything within his reach instead. He tasted every bolt of silk himself before it was agreed upon. He counted warehouse inventory personally rather than trust a servant's count. He arrived at every negotiation having already rehearsed 6 versions of how it might go and what he would do in each case. He was not paranoid. He was, in his own estimation, simply awake in a world where most people slept. And for many years, this approach worked. The business grew. The compound grew. The lists grew longer and more detailed. And so did the distance between what he controlled and what he actually wanted. In his 42nd year, things started to shift. A merchant he had been doing business with for a decade backed out of an agreement, not from bad faith, but because the trade routes had changed, the market had moved, and what had been profitable was no longer so. Wei drafted 3 letters insisting on the terms of their old deal. The merchant did not reply. His son, now 16, announced that he wanted to study calligraphy and poetry, not trade. Wei sat across the table from him and said, quietly but firmly, that poetry was not a life. That he had worked too hard to let his son waste what had been built. His son said nothing, but that night, he moved his sleeping mat to the far corner of the room. And his wife, she had begun sitting alone in the evenings, looking at nothing in particular. When Wei asked what was wrong, she said, "Nothing is wrong. Everything is exactly as you arranged it." He did not know what she meant. He went back to his letters, but her words stayed with him in the hours before sleep, when the house was quiet and the lists on his desk had nothing left to add. He turned them over in his mind, searching for the complaint hidden inside, the grievance he could address, the problem he could write a letter about. He found nothing. That was the unsettling thing. She was not accusing. She was simply describing reality, and somehow the description, stated plainly and without anger, was worse than any accusation he could have answered. He wrote 3 different replies in his journal that week: explanations, corrections, careful arguments, and never said any of them aloud. What was there to argue against? She was right. It was all exactly as he had arranged it. His response to slippage was always the same: more pressure. He sent more letters. He called in favors. He found other merchants to replace the first, offered lower prices than he could afford, accepted terms that would take years to recover from. He enrolled his son in the trade school himself, paid the fees in advance, and told himself the boy would thank him. He began keeping a second ledger that autumn, not of goods or debts, but of letters sent. He wanted to know precisely how many times he had tried. By the time winter arrived, the count for this one stalled trade arrangement stood at 53 letters. There was something in the act of counting that comforted him. The same way a man who is lost might study a map of a region he cannot locate himself within. At least the effort is visible. At least something can be measured. He could not control whether the other merchant responded, but he could control the number of times he reached out. He could make the trying itself undeniable. The ledgers balanced, but the house grew silent. His son chewed his meals with his eyes fixed on the floor, and his wife moved through the rooms like a guest who had overstayed. One evening, Wei sat alone at his desk long after the lamps had dimmed. He had everything he had worked for, and none of it felt like his anymore. He traveled that spring, not for trade, but because something in him needed to be somewhere he had not arranged. He had heard of an old teacher who lived near the river, a man who had studied under the scholars of the Taoist tradition. People in the village said he was unusual, that he spent most of his time watching things rather than doing them. Wei found him sitting on a stone at the edge of the river, perfectly still, looking at the water as it moved around a large boulder in the middle of the current. Wei sat beside him, and after a long silence said, "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. I work harder than anyone I know, and still things fall apart." The old man did not answer right away. He just pointed at the river. "Look at the water," the old man said at last. "Does it fight the rock?" Wei looked. The river flowed around the boulder, curving, splitting, rejoining itself on the other side. The water did not stop. It did not force. It simply moved. "No," Wei said. "It goes around." "And which one wins?" the old man asked. Wei thought about it. Over centuries, rivers shaped stone. The rock wore away, slowly, imperceptibly, but complete. The water did not insist on going through. It went where it could go. And in going where it could go, it eventually went everywhere. Lao Tzu wrote, the old man said, that the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest. Not because it is weak, but because it does not resist what is. Wei sat with that for a long time. "I have been trying to be the rock," he finally said. "Yes," said the old man. "You have." Then the old man reached down and lifted a small flat stone from the riverbank. He placed it in Wei's open palm. It was cool, smooth, heavier than it looked. "This stone has been in the river for perhaps 300 years, the old man said. "It did not enter as a smooth stone. It entered angular, full of sharp edges. What happened to it?" Wei looked at the stone, its worn surface, its perfect roundness. The water wore it down. "No," the old man said gently. "The water simply kept moving. The stone changed because it stayed in the current long enough. The water did not attack the sharpness. The water never stopped flowing past it." He paused. "You cannot force a stone smooth. You can only keep the water moving." Wei turned the stone over in his palm. He thought of 53 letters, of a son who had moved his sleeping mat to the far corner of the room, of a wife who had stopped asking him anything because she already knew exactly how he would arrange the answer. "What does the water lose?" Wei asked slowly. "By going around the rock." The old man looked at him for a moment, then back at the river. "Nothing," he said. "It arrives at the sea either way." Wei returned home, changed, not dramatically, not all at once. Change of this kind is quiet. It does not announce itself. He did not send another letter demanding the old trade deal be honored. He let it go. Within 2 months, the merchant wrote to him with a new proposal, different terms, a different arrangement, but one that actually worked better for both of them. He told his son that the trade school fees were already paid, but that he would not require him to go. His son stared at him for a long moment, then asked if he could still be part of the business someday, just in a different way. They talked for the first time in years, and his wife, he stopped trying to fix what was wrong and simply began to be present, to sit beside her in the evenings without an agenda. She was quiet at first, then, slowly, less so. None of this happened because he stopped caring. He cared more than ever. He had simply stopped confusing caring with controlling. 3 years later, Wei's business was stronger than it had ever been, not because he had forced it, but because he had become better at reading what was possible, rather than insisting on what he had planned. His son had found a role translating trade documents for foreign merchants, a position that required both literary skill and commercial sense. Something between calligraphy and commerce. He had found it himself, without anyone arranging it. And Wei's wife, one evening, reached across the table and held his hand without saying anything. He thought about the river, how it never went backward, how it never argued with the landscape, how it arrived at the sea not by overpowering everything in its path, but by following, always, the shape of what was already there. What surprised Wei in those years was not the relief. He had expected relief. What surprised him was a quieter feeling underneath it, something close to grief, a strange, private grief, for all the years he had spent believing that tightening his grip was the same thing as care. For the version of himself at 20, newly in business, certain that the answer to every slipping thing was more effort, more letters, more force. That young man had not been entirely wrong. He had simply confused the map with the territory, confused the plan with the destination. He had spent decades maintaining control of the route and had barely noticed where it was taking him. The river does not plan its route. It reads the landscape and moves accordingly. Every bend it makes is not a failure to go straight. It is information. It is the river learning the shape of the world it is traveling through. There is a teaching from Lao Tzu that Wei carried with him for the rest of his life. Act without forcing. Flow without insisting. Trust that the water finds its way. He had spent 40 years trying to be unmovable. What changed his life was learning to move. Tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you have been forcing lately? You don't need to explain it. One word is enough. If you know someone who is holding on too tightly right now to a plan, a person, a version of how things were supposed to go, send this to them. Sometimes the right words reach us at exactly the right moment. And if you want to find more of these quiet lessons, stay with the silent lesson.